The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty playground of Maplewood Park. Detective Ethan Carter's unmarked patrol car rolled slowly along the street, the tires crunching over loose gravel. Maplewood was a quiet town, a place where the most exciting events were football games and annual fairs. But today, something felt different. Ethan had always prided himself on his sharp instincts, a skill honed over a decade in the force. His pale blue eyes scanned the park, drawn to the faint movement near the swing set. A young girl, no older than 8, sat slumped on a swing, her small hands clutching the chain links. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, and her faded blue jacket was too thin for the crisp November air. Ethan pulled the car to the curb, cutting the engine. His hand rested momentarily on the steering wheel as he debated his approach. It wasn't unusual for kids to linger in the park after school. But something about her posture, the way she seemed so utterly still, made his chest tighten. Stepping out of the car, Ethan adjusted his jacket against the cold breeze. As he approached, the girl didn't look up. Her small frame seemed dwarfed by the empty swings around her. "Hey there," Ethan called gently, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The girl's head lifted slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she said nothing, and Ethan caught the flicker of something in her expression, fear. Perhaps, or hesitation. "I'm just waiting," she murmured, her voice so soft that the words nearly vanished in the wind. Ethan crouched a few feet away, keeping his tone steady. "Waiting for who?" She glanced at the ground, her fingers tightening on the swing's chain. "My dad. He said he'd come back." Ethan felt a pang of unease. "How long have you been waiting?" The girl hesitated, her brows knitting together as if trying to remember. "A few days, I think. He told me to stay here. He said it was safe." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through Ethan. He glanced around the playground, now bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and then back at the girl. She couldn't have been here for days, alone. In the cold. It wasn't possible. But the dark circles under her eyes and the dirt smudged on her cheeks told a different story. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Mia," she replied, barely above a whisper. "Mia, my name's Ethan. I'm a detective. Can you tell me where your dad went?" Mia shrugged, her small shoulders sagging. "He said he had to go take care of something. He said he'd be back soon." Ethan's chest tightened. He needed to act, and quickly. "Mia, I want to help you. But you can't stay out here by yourself. Do you have somewhere else to go? Family? Friends?" She shook her head, and Ethan could see the tears welling in her eyes. "It's just me and Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many cases of abandonment. Too many kids left to fend for themselves. But something about Mia's quiet faith in her father's return made him pause. He couldn't jump to conclusions, he needed to dig deeper. "Okay," he said softly, standing and extending a hand. "How about we get you somewhere warm for now? We can figure this out together." Mia hesitated, her wide eyes searching his face. For a moment, Ethan thought she might refuse. But then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. In the warmth of the station's break room, Ethan handed Mia a cup of hot chocolate. She sat at the small table, her legs swinging back and forth as she cradled the mug. Ethan had sent out a bulletin about her situation, but he knew it would take time for any leads to come in. "You've been very brave, Mia," Ethan said, sitting across from her. "Can you tell me a little more about your dad? His name? Where you live?" She hesitated, staring into the cup. "His name is David. We lived in an apartment near the park. But we had to leave." Ethan leaned forward. "Why did you have to leave?" Mia bit her lip, her small fingers tightening around the mug. "Dad said we couldn't stay there anymore. Some people were mad at him. He said we'd be okay if we stayed in the park." Ethan's stomach churned. This wasn't just a case of neglect. It sounded like David had been in trouble. The kind of trouble that left an 8-year-old girl sleeping in a park. "I'll need to ask a few more questions," Ethan said gently, pulling out a notepad. "But first, let's make sure you're comfortable. Is there anything you need?" Mia shook her head, her gaze distant. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He had handled countless difficult cases over the years. But this one felt different. There was something about Mia, her quiet resilience, her unwavering belief in her father, that struck a chord deep within him. As he stood and made his way to his desk, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Mia's situation was more than just another case, it was a call to action. And Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of man to walk away. The station buzzed with its usual activity as Ethan settled at his desk, his thoughts consumed by Mia's story. Across the room, Officer Jenna Morales, his closest colleague, glanced up from her paperwork. "Who's the kid?" she asked, nodding toward the break room where Mia was quietly sipping her hot chocolate. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mia. Found her alone at the park. Says her dad's been gone for days. Sounds like he was in some kind of trouble." Jenna frowned, setting her pen down. "What kind of trouble?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face grim. "She mentioned something about people being mad at him. I don't know the details yet, but it doesn't sound good." Jenna's eyes softened as she glanced toward the break room. "Poor kid. You think the dad abandoned her?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm not jumping to conclusions. Not yet, but I need to find him, and fast." Pulling out his laptop, Ethan began digging into the system. He searched for any recent incidents involving David, cross-referencing the information Mia had given him. It wasn't much to go on, but he hoped it would lead somewhere. As he worked, Jenna approached, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You've got that look," she said, handing him the cup. "What look?" "The one that says you're about to take this case way too personally." Ethan huffed out a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Someone has to." Jenna rested a hand on his shoulder. "Just don't burn yourself out. Carter, you can't save everyone." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't shake the image of Mia sitting alone on that swing. Her eyes filled with quiet hope. Saving her wasn't just about doing his job, it felt like something deeper. Something he couldn't quite put into words. Later that evening, Ethan drove Mia to the local child services shelter, a modest brick building tucked between an old library and a community center. The woman at the front desk greeted them with a warm smile. But Mia clung to Ethan's side, her small hand gripping his coat. "It's just for a little while," Ethan said softly, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I'll keep looking for your dad. I promise." Mia's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded bravely. "Okay," she whispered. As the shelter worker led Mia inside, Ethan felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He had done this countless times before, helped place kids in temporary care, but this time was different. Watching Mia walk away felt like he was letting her down. Back at the station, Ethan stayed late, combing through records and making phone calls. He managed to find an address for David and Mia's last known apartment. Early the next morning, he drove to the complex, a rundown building with peeling paint and broken shutters. Inside, the hallways smelled of mildew, and the dim lighting flickered overhead. Apartment 4B was marked with a rusted number barely hanging on the door. Ethan knocked twice, his knuckles echoing in the quiet corridor. No answer. He tried again, this time louder. "David? This is Detective Carter. I need to talk to you." Still nothing. Ethan sighed, glancing up and down the hallway before trying the doorknob. It turned easily in his hand, and the door creaked open. The apartment was a mess. Clothes were strewn across the floor, and the furniture was sparse, a single couch, a wobbly table, and a mattress without a frame. Ethan's trained eyes scanned the room, noting the signs of a hasty departure. Drawers were left open, a suitcase half-packed near the door. On the kitchen counter, he spotted an envelope addressed to David, stamped with a bright red, "Final Notice." Ethan picked up the envelope, flipping it over. Inside were eviction papers and a handful of overdue bills. He felt his chest tighten as he imagined David's struggle to keep a roof over Mia's head. Whatever trouble he'd gotten himself into, it was clear he hadn't been able to outrun it. As Ethan continued searching, he found something that stopped him cold, a photograph tucked into a battered wallet on the coffee table. It was a picture of Mia and David, smiling brightly under a summer sky. The sight of Mia's joyful face sent a pang through Ethan's chest. This wasn't the face of a girl abandoned by her father. This was the face of a child who had been loved. Ethan slipped the wallet into an evidence bag, his mind racing. He needed to find David. And fast. Back at the station, Ethan shared his findings with Jenna. He didn't just leave her, he said, laying the photograph on the desk. Something happened. He was in trouble. Jenna studied the photograph, her brow furrowing. If that's true, We need to figure out who he was running from. Ethan nodded, pulling up recent police reports. I'll start with local incidents. If David was in debt or involved with the wrong crowd, there has to be a trail. For hours, they pored over records, piecing together fragments of David's life. He had been a construction worker, often picking up odd jobs to make ends meet. Recently, he'd taken out several small loans from a local lending agency, loans he hadn't been able to repay. This agency, Jenna said, pointing to the name on the screen. It's been flagged before. Predatory lending, connections to illegal collections. Ethan's jaw tightened. If David couldn't pay, they might have come after him. Jenna glanced at him, concern etched on her face. Be careful, Ethan. If these guys are dangerous, I'll handle it, Ethan said firmly. I'm not letting Mia lose her dad without a fight. Ethan's next stop was the lending agency, a nondescript office in a strip mall on the edge of town. The man behind the counter was greasy and smug, his shirt stained with coffee. David who? He asked, leaning back in his chair. David Harris, Ethan said, flashing his badge. He owes you money. The man smirked. A lot of people owe us money. Detective. Ethan's patience wore thin. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Listen, I don't care about your business. I care about finding David Harris. If you know where he is, you'd better start talking. The man hesitated, his smirk faltering under Ethan's piercing gaze. I don't know where he is. Okay? Last I heard, he was trying to get out of town. Said he'd pay up as soon as he could. That's all I know. Ethan didn't believe him, but he knew he wouldn't get more without a warrant. As he left the office, his mind churned with questions. Where had David gone, and what would he find when he got there? The following morning, Ethan made his way back to the shelter. Despite the exhaustion weighing him down, he was determined to see Mia. He needed to hear her voice, to remind himself why this case mattered so much. Inside, Mia sat at a small table with a coloring book, her face illuminated by the soft light streaming through the window. She looked up when Ethan entered, her expression brightening instantly. Detective Ethan, she exclaimed, setting her crayons aside. Ethan smiled, the corners of his mouth softening in a way that felt unfamiliar. Hey, Mia, how are you holding up? She shrugged, her fingers idly twisting the edge of the coloring book. I miss my dad, she admitted, her voice small. Did you find him yet? Ethan knelt beside her, his heart tightening. Not yet, but I'm getting closer. I promise I won't stop until I find him. Mia's dark eyes searched his face, and Ethan felt a flicker of guilt. He wasn't used to making promises, especially not ones so personal. But for Mia, he couldn't bring himself to hold back. Do you want to tell me more about him? Ethan asked gently, hoping to learn something that might help. Mia's expression softened as she nodded. He's really funny, she said, her voice tinged with warmth. He used to make up silly songs to cheer me up when I was sad. And he always said we were a team, just the two of us. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. The more he heard about David, the more he was convinced that Mia's father hadn't abandoned her. Something, or someone, had forced him to leave. Back at the station, Ethan spent the next several days piecing together David's life. His financial troubles painted a grim picture, and Ethan was certain that the lending agency was just the tip of the iceberg. He tracked down old coworkers, landlords, and even acquaintances, but each lead seemed to raise more questions than answers. One night, while poring over his notes, Jenna approached his desk. You've been at this nonstop, she said, crossing her arms. When's the last time you slept? Ethan waved her off. I'll sleep when I find him. Jenna sighed, pulling up a chair. I get it, Ethan, I do, but you're not going to help Mia if you're running on fumes. Ethan hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. He glanced at the photograph of Mia and David pinned to his board. The smiling face is a stark contrast to the grim reality they now faced. Maybe you're right, he admitted quietly. The next afternoon, Ethan returned to the shelter. He brought a small gift, a set of brightly colored markers he'd picked up on his way. When he handed them to Mia, her face lit up, and Ethan felt a flicker of pride. Thank you, she said, hugging the markers to her chest. As Mia settled back into her coloring, Ethan found himself sitting beside her, watching as she carefully filled the pages with vibrant hues. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. Can I ask you something? Mia said suddenly. glancing up at him. "Of course," Ethan replied. "Do you have a family?" Ethan hesitated. The question caught him off guard, and he wasn't sure how to answer. "Not really," he said finally. "It's just me." Mia frowned. "But don't you get lonely?" Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He had spent years avoiding that question, burying himself in work to ignore the emptiness that lingered in his life. But looking at Mia, he couldn't bring himself to lie. "Sometimes," he admitted. Mia studied him for a moment before offering a small, reassuring smile. "Well, you're not alone right now." Ethan felt his throat tighten, her simple words striking a chord he hadn't realized was there. As days turned into weeks, Ethan and Mia began to form a bond. Each visit to the shelter brought new stories, new laughs, and new moments that reminded Ethan why he had chosen this path. Mia's resilience, her quiet strength, and her unwavering belief in her father inspired him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, Ethan's investigation continued to progress. A call from one of David's former co-workers led Ethan to a local bar, where David had reportedly been seen arguing with a man shortly before his disappearance. The bartender, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, was reluctant to talk at first, but after some gentle prodding, he admitted that David had been in trouble. He owed money, the bartender said, wiping down the counter. "And the guy he owed it to? Not someone you want to mess with." Ethan's stomach churned. "Do you have a name?" The bartender hesitated before nodding. "Derek Kane. He's got a reputation around here. If your guy was dealing with him, he's in deep." Ethan thanked the bartender and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. Derek Kane was a name he'd heard before, a small-time enforcer known for shaking people down when they couldn't pay. If David had crossed paths with Kane, it meant Ethan was on the right track, but it also meant the situation was more dangerous than he'd anticipated. When Ethan visited Mia the next day, he tried to mask his worry, but Mia was perceptive, her sharp eyes catching the tension in his expression. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Ethan hesitated. "I found someone who might know where your dad is, but it's going to take a little more time." Mia nodded, her gaze steady. "I know you'll find him," she said confidently. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Mia's faith in him was both humbling and daunting, and he silently vowed not to let her down. Ethan stared at the name scribbled in his notebook, Derek Kane. His gut told him this was the lead he needed to find David Harris. Kane's reputation as a lone enforcer had earned him the nickname, the Collector, and it wasn't for his stamp collection. Ethan had dealt with men like him before, dangerous, desperate, and always willing to cross the line. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan shut his notebook with a determined snap. He couldn't wait for backup. Kane wasn't the kind of man you approached with a full entourage. Sometimes, subtlety was the best weapon. The next day, Ethan parked his unmarked car outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was one of Kane's known hangouts, the kind of place where shady deals went unnoticed by the general public. Ethan stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter against the biting wind. His holster weighed heavy on his hip, but he hoped he wouldn't need it. Inside, the warehouse smelled of damp concrete and stale smoke. A group of men sat around a table in the center, a single hanging bulb casting harsh shadows across their faces. Ethan recognized Kane immediately, broad shoulders, a scar running from his temple to his jawline, and a predatory grin that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. Kane's grin widened as Ethan approached. Well, if it isn't one of Maplewood's finest. What brings you to my humble establishment?" "I need answers," Ethan said, his tone steady. "David Harris, where is he?" Kane leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette with deliberate slowness. "David Harris, that name does ring a bell, but my memory's a little fuzzy. Maybe you could jog it?" Ethan's patience wore thin. "I'm not here to play games. Kane, David owes you money. I know you've been after him. Where is he?" Kane exhaled a cloud of smoke, his expression amused. "You cops are always so serious. Look, I don't keep tabs on every debtor. But if David's smart, he's keeping a low profile. He's got a kid, doesn't he? Sweet little girl?" Ethan's blood ran cold. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Leave the girl out of this." Kane held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, relax. I'm not interested in kids. But David? He made some bad choices. Choices that got him into debt he couldn't pay. Last I heard, he was trying to cut a deal to clear his name. What kind of deal? Ethan demanded. Cain shrugged. Ask around. He was desperate. Though, people like that don't last long. Ethan clenched his fists, every instinct telling him to haul Cain in right then and there. But without solid evidence, he couldn't make an arrest. For now, he'd have to let Cain go and focus on finding David. Over the next few days, Ethan followed every lead Cain had given him, piecing together David's movements like a scattered puzzle. It led him to a seedy motel on the edge of the city. A place where the neon vacancy sign flickered like a warning. The desk clerk, a wiry man with yellowed teeth, confirmed that David had stayed there briefly but had left in a hurry. Didn't say where he was going, the clerk said, sliding a greasy notepad across the counter. But he left this behind. Ethan flipped through the pages, his heart racing. The notepad was filled with frantic scribbles, names, addresses, and a series of dates. At the bottom of the last page was a single phrase underlined twice: "Keep Mia safe." Ethan's grip tightened on the notepad. David hadn't abandoned his daughter, he'd been trying to protect her. But from what? That evening, Ethan visited Mia again. She was sitting in the shelter's playroom, drawing with the markers he'd given her. When she saw him, her face lit up, but Ethan could see the question in her eyes. Did you find him? I'm getting closer, Ethan said, kneeling beside her. I found something your dad left behind. He's trying to keep you safe. Mia, that's why he's been away. Mia nodded slowly, her small hands clutching the markers. I knew he wouldn't leave me, she said quietly. Ethan hesitated. Mia, do you remember anything your dad said before you left? Anything that might help me find him? Mia thought for a moment. Her brow furrowed. He said we had to be careful. That some people didn't like him. But he promised he'd come back for me. She paused, her voice growing even softer. He told me I was the most important thing in the world. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. We're going to find him. Mia, I promise. The next lead brought Ethan to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of a neighboring town. According to the notes David had left, this was where he'd planned to meet someone, a person who might have helped him clear his debt. The factory was eerily quiet, the sound of Ethan's footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. He moved cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a figure slumped against the wall. It was David. Ethan rushed forward, his heart pounding. David was alive, but barely. His face was bruised, and his clothes were torn. David, Ethan said urgently, kneeling beside him. Can you hear me? David's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. Mia, he croaked. Where's Mia? She's safe, Ethan assured him. She's waiting for you, but we need to get you out of here. David nodded weakly, and Ethan helped him to his feet. As they made their way out of the factory, Ethan felt a surge of relief. He'd found David. Now, all that mattered was bringing him home to Mia. When Ethan brought David to the hospital, he stayed by his side until the doctors assured him he would recover. As he sat in the waiting room, Ethan thought about Mia and the look on her face when she saw her father again. It was the moment he'd been working toward, the moment that made all the long nights and dead ends worth it. But as much as he wanted to see her smile, Ethan couldn't ignore the knot of fear in his chest. Whatever trouble David had been in, it wasn't over yet. 2 days later, David Harris was stable enough to leave the hospital, though he still looked worse for wear. His bruises had darkened, and a bandage covered the gash on his temple. Despite his physical state, his eyes burned with a single, fierce question. Where's Mia? Ethan stood by his bedside, arms crossed. She's safe, David. She's been waiting for you. But before I take you to her, I need answers. What happened? Why were you running? David's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the weight of his situation seemed to crush him. I made some bad choices, he admitted, his voice hoarse. I took out loans I couldn't repay. I thought I could dig us out, but the debts just kept piling up. When Cain came knocking, I realized I couldn't protect Mia. So I ran. Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tight. You didn't just run, David. You left an 8-year-old girl sleeping in a park, alone. You put her in danger. David's head dropped into his hands. I know I failed her. But I didn't have a choice. If I'd stayed, Cain would have used her to get to me. I couldn't risk it. Ethan's anger cooled, replaced by a grudging understanding. What about the factory? Why were you there? I was trying to buy time. David said. Kane's men were after me. So I set up a meeting with someone who said they could help, a friend from my construction days. But they didn't show. And Kane's guys found me first. Ethan nodded, piecing the story together. Kane's not going to stop. David, not unless we make him. David looked up, desperation flickering in his eyes. What can I do? I don't have the money to pay him off. You don't need money, Ethan said firmly. You need protection. I can help you, but you have to trust me. No more running. David hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Okay, I'll do whatever it takes. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove David to the shelter. The atmosphere in the car was tense, the air thick with unspoken emotions. David sat silently, his hands fidgeting in his lap. As they pulled into the parking lot, Ethan glanced at him. She's been waiting for you. David, don't make her wait any longer. David swallowed hard, then nodded. Inside, Mia was sitting in the playroom, surrounded by the brightly colored drawings she'd made over the past few weeks. When she saw Ethan, her face lit up, but her eyes immediately shifted to the man standing behind him. Daddy? David's voice cracked as he stepped forward. Mia. In an instant, Mia was on her feet, running toward him with all the force her small body could muster. David dropped to his knees, catching her in his arms and holding her tight. I missed you so much. Daddy, Mia sobbed, her small hands clutching his jacket. David's tears fell freely as he buried his face in her hair. I missed you too, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Ethan stood silently by the door, his throat tightening at the sight. He had imagined this moment countless times, but seeing it unfold in front of him was overwhelming. That evening, Ethan sat with David and Mia in a quiet corner of the shelter. David's arm was draped protectively around Mia, who leaned against his side, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but her smile unwavering. What happens now? David asked, his voice low. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Now, we figure out a way to keep you both safe. Kane isn't going to let this go. But we can build a case against him. If you're willing to testify, we can take him down. David hesitated, his gaze flickering to Mia. And what happens to her? What if something happens to me? She's not alone, Ethan said firmly. You're not alone. We'll figure this out together. Over the next week, Ethan worked tirelessly to ensure David and Mia's safety. He arranged for them to stay in a temporary safe house while he built a case against Kane. With David's cooperation, Ethan gathered evidence of Kane's illegal activities, records of threats, forged contracts, and predatory practices that had ensnared countless victims. Throughout it all, Ethan visited the safe house regularly. Mia greeted him with the same bright smile every time, and he found himself looking forward to their conversations. She showed him her drawings, told him stories about her dad, and even tried to teach him how to play the card game she'd made up. You're really bad at this, she teased one evening, giggling as Ethan struggled to keep track of the rules. Yeah, well, maybe you're just a card shark, Ethan replied, grinning. David watched from across the room, a small smile tugging at his lips. She really likes you, you know, he said quietly when Mia wasn't listening. Ethan glanced at him, his expression softening. She's a special kid. David nodded, his face growing serious. You've done more for us than I could ever repay. Thank you, Ethan. You don't owe me anything, Ethan said. Just take care of her. The day finally came when Kane was arrested. With David's testimony and the evidence Ethan had gathered, the case against him was airtight. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight lift from his shoulders. That evening, he visited the safe house to share the news. Mia was the first to greet him, throwing her arms around his waist in excitement. Does this mean we don't have to hide anymore? She asked, her eyes wide with hope. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. That's right, kiddo. You and your dad are safe now. David stepped forward, his expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, Ethan. You don't have to, Ethan said. Just keep moving forward. You've got a second chance, don't waste it. The reunion marked a turning point for all three of them. David and Mia began to rebuild their lives, starting fresh in a new apartment provided by the shelter. Ethan helped them settle in, his presence becoming a constant in their lives. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner, Mia looked up at Ethan with a shy smile. You're like family now, you know. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the words hitting him harder than he expected. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was on the outside looking in. Yeah, he said softly, I guess I am. In the weeks following Kane's arrest, life began to take on a new rhythm for David and Mia. Their new apartment, modest but cozy, quickly became a home. Ethan helped where he could, making sure they had everything they needed: furniture, school supplies for Mia, even small touches like curtains and a lamp for her room. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan arrived with a surprise. As Mia opened the door, she gasped at the sight of the small, floppy-eared puppy cradled in his arms. Is he for me? She asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Ethan smiled. He's for both of you. Every family needs a good dog, right? David appeared in the doorway, shaking his head with a laugh. You're spoiling her, Carter. She deserves it, Ethan said simply, setting the puppy down. It yipped happily as Mia scooped it into her arms. David watched his daughter's joy with a bittersweet expression. You've done more for us than I can ever repay. Ethan, you didn't just save our lives. You gave us a chance to really live again. Ethan shrugged, though he felt the warmth of David's words settle deep in his chest. You've done the hard part, David. I just gave you a little push. The holidays arrived in a flurry of snow and twinkling lights, and Mia made it her mission to turn the apartment into a winter wonderland. Paper snowflakes adorned the windows, and a small, crooked Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, decorated with ornaments she'd made herself. You had to come for Christmas dinner, Mia declared one afternoon, her hands on her hips in a perfect imitation of authority. Ethan chuckled. I don't know, kiddo. I don't want to intrude. You're not intruding, David said from the kitchen, where he was attempting to string popcorn garlands. We want you here. Your family now. The word family still caught Ethan off guard, but he nodded, his throat tight. All right, he said, I'll be here. On Christmas Day, Ethan arrived with a bag of gifts and a bottle of wine for David. The apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of roasted turkey and the sound of Mia's laughter. They sat around the small dining table, sharing stories and jokes as the snow fell softly outside. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he belonged. After dinner, Mia disappeared into her room and returned with a small wrapped package. She handed it to Ethan, her smile shy. It's for you, she said. Ethan carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a framed drawing. It showed 3 figures standing under a bright sun: Mia, David, and himself. Above them, in Mia's neat handwriting, were the words, "My family." Ethan stared at the picture, his chest tight. Thank you, Mia, he said softly. This means more to me than you know. You mean a lot to us too, Mia said, her voice serious. David nodded, raising his glass. To new beginnings, he said. Ethan clinked his glass against theirs, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. As the months went on, Ethan remained a constant presence in their lives. He helped Mia with her school projects, shared beers with David on the weekends, and even took the dog on long walks when David was busy. One spring afternoon, as they sat on the porch, David turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. Have you ever thought about settling down? Ethan raised an eyebrow. What, you mean like you? David chuckled. I mean it, Ethan. You've got a big heart. Even if you try to hide it. Maybe it's time to let someone in. Ethan considered the words, his gaze drifting to where Mia was playing with the dog in the yard. He thought about the changes he'd gone through, the walls he'd torn down, the connections he'd made. Maybe, he said finally. But for now, I think I'm right where I need to be. David smiled. We're glad you're here, Ethan. We couldn't have made it without you. You don't have to thank me, Ethan said, his voice soft. We're a team, right? Just like you and Mia. David nodded, his expression warm. Yeah, we are. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in golden light, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent so many years searching for something he couldn't name. And now, he realized, he had found it. Family wasn't about blood, it was about love, trust, and showing up when it mattered most. And in Mia and David, Ethan had found the family he never knew he needed.